As well, good evening to everyone joining us virtually. Welcome as well to this public consultation on the Cannabis and Industrial Hemp Bill. Tonight is our final community stakeholder consultation, culminating a third week of consultations. We started in Soufrière, followed by Dennery. Last week, we were in Grosley, Babonneau, and Vieux-Fort. And yesterday, we were in Ancillary. And of course, this evening, we're culminating here in Castries. We will commence tonight with a prayer. If we could please all stand, to be led by Ms. Wilson.
Heavenly Father, thank you for the opportunity for all of us reaching here safely. Bless us with your presence as we keep open-minded to all the benefits that come with this consultation. Thank you for the opportunity of a new day, and as well as the opportunities that this bill brings for us as a people as well as a country. Please allow everyone here to reach here safely, keep open-minded and positive as we grow as a nation, learning what the cannabis and industrial hemp can do for everyone in this room. Thank you for your blessings. Thank you for your presence. Thank you for everything you do for each of us in this room. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you. Please be seated. So my name is Shamil Joseph Pierre. I am the Corporate Secretary of the Regulated Substances Authority. To my left is Dylan Norbert Inglis. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the RSA. And Raquel Wilson, who just prayed for us, she's the Executive Secretary. So our team is presently comprised of 3 persons. However, that will be expanding very shortly as we do have the mandate for establishing a cannabis regime in St. Lucia. There is the board of the RSA responsible for policy matters and otherwise, led by Mr. John Joseph, the chairperson who has an expertise in business. The deputy chairperson is Vernie Manuel, the director of the Bureau of Standards. We also have Ms. Sophia Alfie Henry, who is the PS in the Ministry of Commerce. Mr. Francis Fontenelle, PS in the Ministry of Finance. Rosemary Pierre-Louis, who is the representative of civil society. Mr. Kurt Harris, who's a person with expertise in science. And as well, Dr. Stephen King with expertise in medicine. So that completes our 7-member board, and the RSA is under the Ministry of Commerce, which of course is headed by the Honorable Emma Hippolyte, Minister for Commerce. So that is just some background about us. I will now hand over to the CEO, who will commence the presentation on the Cannabis and Industrial Hemp Bill. If we say anything that you have a question on that specific matter, then kindly just raise your hand. We will take your question. However, if you have any general questions at the end of the presentation, we will open the floor to answer any other questions that you may have.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for those who have come in person, and thank you as well to those joining us virtually on the Zoom platform and on YouTube. St. Lucians in the diaspora, persons overseas with an interest in the cannabis regime, thank you for coming. As introduced, my name is Dylan Norbert Inglis, and I am the CEO of the Regulated Substances Authority. The authority was created in 2023 by the Regulated Substances Act, with a mandate given to examine the status quo with regard to substances that require regulation in St. Lucia. The first substance that we have been tasked with revising and implementing a regime for is cannabis. But there is also an intention and appetite for us to revise the regime with regard to radiation safety and security, alcohol, petroleum, explosives, a number of substances which we believe may not be adequately regulated in the circumstances and may require a modernization of the frameworks that they operate under. So the RSA, having been tasked with implementing a cannabis regime as its first course of action, has assisted the Ministry of Commerce and the AG's chambers in conceptualizing this bill. The Cannabis and Industrial Hemp Bill, as it has been drafted, has been circulated for public consumption, for review, and for advice as to what should be part and parcel of the industry, which will soon be implemented in St. Lucia. So we start off with what is cannabis, and many may know the answer, but for the benefit of those who do not, cannabis is a plant. And that plant has many compounds and chemicals, some of which are called cannabinoids. Some of these cannabinoids, and one popular cannabinoid is THC, which many of us are familiar with. That cannabinoid binds with receptors in the brain and causes an effect that we refer to as feeling high or intoxicated. Industrial hemp is a variety of cannabis. The industrial hemp plant, however, has a very low amount of the THC cannabinoid we referenced earlier. But that plant, because of how it is grown and how stocky and burly it is, it can be used for a number of industrial applications. So you can use it to create hemp fiber, hemp board, hempcrete, hemp plastics. There's a variety of applications that plant can be used to create. Is cannabis currently legal? Before we pass the proposed cannabis legislation, the status quo allows an individual to be in possession of 30 grams of cannabis on their person. That is the current law. You are also permitted to cultivate 4 plants per household. That is the current law. Sale of cannabis, cultivation in excess of the 4 plants, importation of cannabis, exportation of cannabis, all of these activities remain illegal in the current dispensation of the law. And that is what this piece of legislation will seek to change.
So at this juncture, one may ask the question, why legalize cannabis? So as we know, cannabis is a plant, and it can be used to treat an array of different health problems. So that includes arthritis, depression, inflammation, pain, lack of appetite, and asthma. And one does not need to smoke cannabis to get the benefits from cannabis. You may be aware that there are tinctures, topical pain relief treatments, edibles, and other non-smoking applications that one can use to also derive the benefits of cannabis. As well, of course, with the leaf, many of our parents or grandparents from way back may have been using it to make tea as well. The global cannabis market size is projected to grow from US $57.18 billion in 2023 US dollars to $444.34 billion US dollars by 2030. So that is a significant amount of increase in revenue projected. And under this draft bill, there are various ways which one can generate revenue, which I'm going to speak to now. However, please be mindful that you will require a license in order to take part in this activity, namely cultivating cannabis or industrial hemp, transporting cannabis products or industrial hemp products, processing cannabis or industrial hemp, exporting cannabis, industrial hemp, or cannabis products, conducting research on cannabis or industrial hemp and its products, selling cannabis products and industrial hemp products, or providing an enclosed area where one can use or consume cannabis or a cannabis product. So you require a license for all of those things, but of course there's a financial benefit that you would derive from cannabis. Another financial benefit of cannabis is as an alternative to pharmaceutical products. We would appreciate with pharmaceutical products, we have scientists involved, it's made in a lab, so it can be more costly than cannabis being a natural product and a plant which one can use as well for effective medical treatment. So what is the Cannabis and Industrial Hemp Bill proposing to change? The bill will allow licenses to be used to grow cannabis, manufacture, import, export, test, transport, and sell cannabis and cannabis products. These are all commercial activities, and of course we require a license to do so. if one does not have a license, it will remain illegal or criminalized to do any of those things with cannabis. So that is why applying to the RSA for those requisite licenses would be very important. The application process, the forms, the fees, etc., will be published in regulations once the bill is passed. As well, it is important to note that whereas we are technocrats, experts' advice will also be sought on the implementation of this entire cannabis regime. So the bill provides for the Minister of Commerce to appoint a Cannabis Advisory Council, which will comprise of the following persons who will give both the RSA board and the minister advice to support the safe and effective use of medicinal cannabis in St. Lucia. So that council will comprise of the chief medical officer or their designate, the CEO of the RSA, a representative of the Rastafarian community, and you will note that throughout discussion on the bill, we will refer to the Rastafarian community quite a bit because we really thought of them in drafting this bill. We appreciate that they have faced a lot of persecution over the years because of their use of cannabis and even been penalized, of course, because of our current legal regime. However, we have taken note of them in this bill. As well, we have a representative of the Medical and Dental Association, a representative of a pharmacy association, a representative of each central trading entity. So there will be 2 central trading entities, which will be the entities responsible for purchasing the cannabis. So the CEO will speak more to that shortly. And also a person with experience, expertise, or qualification in cannabis or business relating to cannabis. So that group of persons will form the advisory council. So that is about 7 members.
So many would ask, as we said earlier, would you be able to cultivate more than the 4 plants? If you do not have a license for cultivation, cultivating more than 4 plants would be prohibited. The treatment that would be meted out to you for cultivating in excess of 4 plants, however, is staggered. So we recognize that a number of individuals who would have cultivated in the current dispensation of the law would have been treated similarly. If you had 6 plants or if you had 50 plants, the offense would be the same. So the proposed legislation actually gives a tiered approach to the treatment of individuals who are cultivating above the 4 plants that is allowed. So if an individual is cultivating in excess of 4 plants but less than 12 plants, it is a Class A offense referred to as cultivating more than 4 plants. If you have more than 12 plants but less than 75 plants, that is deemed a commercial amount of cannabis. So you would be charged with cultivating a commercial amount of cannabis. If you are cultivating in excess of 75 plants, then the offense would be cultivating a trafficable amount of cannabis. And the penalties would be tiered similarly so that an individual who is cultivating 100 plants is not seen and painted with the same brush as an individual who's cultivating 6 plants when he's permitted only 4. Within the legislation, and we wanted to stress this point, there is an amnesty that is granted to individuals. So the Minister of Justice is empowered by this bill to deem a period of time for an amnesty. The Minister of Justice can give that amnesty period for up to 1 year, and during that period, an individual who can evidence that they are cultivating cannabis, that they were cultivating cannabis, or that they are in possession of cannabis, large or small scale amounts of cannabis, may apply to the RSA for an amnesty. If they meet the criteria, the Minister of Justice will be informed, and that individual may be issued a certificate of amnesty. With that certificate of amnesty, as it is proposed in the legislation, the individual will not be liable for them to be charged for the cultivation or possession of cannabis, albeit it is recognized that they were doing so before the law permitted them to have been cultivating or been in possession. If you are issued a certificate of amnesty, that individual is deemed a traditional cultivator. The traditional cultivator nomenclature in the bill, being referred to as a traditional cultivator, would give you certain privileges in the legislation and treat you differently to other persons who would want to be able to benefit from the cannabis regime as outlined in the legislation. So again, if it is that you would have been found at the time that the bill is passed to have been previously cultivating or been in possession of cannabis, you can apply for an amnesty within the amnesty period. After the amnesty period has ended, one will not be able to apply for the amnesty and will not be able to be deemed a traditional cultivator. So if it is that the Minister of Justice determines that it will be 6 months, understanding the length of time for propagation of the plant, if it is that in his wisdom he determines it's 6 months, after that 6-month period, somebody will not be allowed to claim that they are a traditional cultivator and get the amnesty.
What about those, I heard about planters and cultivators, what about those people who are doing cannabis products, related products, who doesn't involve the selling of the plant?
Right, so these persons are still in possession of cannabis or cannabis products. The cannabis and cannabis products are treated similarly, and these persons would be able to apply for the amnesty. And if they are issued the amnesty, they would be deemed under the legislation, even though they weren't cultivating, they would be deemed the traditional cultivators. All right, so the question would then be, go ahead.
Has the RSA and the government determined a time frame for this?
For the
For
amnesty?
the
or for
amnesty, all those...
So as I said, the legislation will allow the Minister of Justice to deem the amnesty period. So when the legislation is passed, the Minister of Justice will by order specify if it is 3 months, if it is 6 months, but he can give up to 1 year. All right? So having received the certificate of amnesty and been deemed a traditional cultivator, if it is that the individual is in possession of cannabis, they would then be able to allow for that cannabis to be sent through the legitimate means that the regime allows for. If it is that that person wants to remain a cultivator, they would then apply for a cultivation license and have to meet the criteria to obtain that license. But again, the fees and treatment of these individuals deemed traditional cultivators would be different in the circumstances. So they would have concessionary rates for their licenses and special treatment given to them. We need to also speak on the central trading entity. So within the bill, there is reference to a CTE. The central trading entity is the entity which will be required in legislation to purchase all the cannabis that is grown in St. Lucia, or to permit the cannabis to go from a cultivator to a processor. The central trading entity, as it is currently drafted, must have an ownership stake of at least 20% traditional cultivators. And we spoke earlier on how an individual would become a traditional cultivator. So in order for a company or cooperative to apply to be a central trading entity, they must evidence that at least 20% of the ownership of the central trading entity is held by traditional cultivators. When you've received the status as a central trading entity, you would also then be able to purchase the cannabis from all of the cannabis cultivators, sell to the dispensaries, and if it is that a cultivator is also a processor, it would make no sense then for you to sell your cannabis to the CTE and buy it back to process. So in those cases, the individual who is cultivating and also wishes to process may pay a fee to the central trading entity and bypass having to sell the cannabis and buy it back. The reason that the central trading entity was created with that percentage of traditional cultivators is that we are cognizant of the fact that you have a number of individuals who may want to come into St. Lucia and invest in the industry. But we are also cognizant of the fact that we have traditional cultivators who have been plying this trade for many years. So the concept of the central trading entity ensures that if an investor comes to St. Lucia tomorrow, that they purchase 20 acres of land that they wish to cultivate on that land and also process cannabis for them to sell, they would be compelled to pay the central trading entity, which is made up of traditional cultivators, every time a plant is propagated in St. Lucia. So that is the reason and thinking behind the central trading entity. The legislation allows for a maximum of 2 at any given time. And again, though the legislation speaks to having a minimum of 20% traditional cultivators, it can be completely owned by traditional cultivators. We understand that, just one second, we understand that you may need investors to come in from overseas who have the liquidity to allow for the funding, because a cultivator will not want to sell their cannabis to a CTE and not receive their funds within a short enough space of time. They would not be in a position to wait until the CTE sells that cannabis and gets the money back to pay to the cultivator. So there is a need for the persons applying to become a CTE to have sufficient financing that they can bridge that gap. Understanding that they may need to invite foreigners into the company, that is why there is a minimum standard set for 20% of the company to be owned by traditional cultivators. You got a question?
Yes, good evening, everybody. In that case, for example, the 20%, what if there are not enough traditional cultivators to meet that 20%?
Based on the figures we have currently, it would be quite easy if the traditional cultivators become part of the industry to meet that number.
Okay, so...
So it essentially is compelling any individual who wants to be a central trading entity to reach out to the traditional cultivators to become part and parcel of that cooperative or company.
In order for this emerging cannabis industry to succeed and to thrive, we appreciate that there must be some security frameworks in place and, of course, operating with international standards. So one of those that we intend to implement is a traceability software, which we call a seed-to-sale platform. So essentially, it will track from the time the cannabis seed is planted and until it is sold. So what that software will do, it will do three main things. Number one, it will satisfy the banks receiving funds from cannabis, that is legitimate funds. So simply put, when you have sold your cannabis and then, for example, let us say you've earned $20,000 and now you want to deposit it to the bank, naturally they would need a source of funds. So you will be able to get through the seed to sale platform your receipt to say we have received this cannabis. It was sold by John Doe, and so these are the proceeds from the sale of cannabis. So it's legitimate funds essentially, because we appreciate that there may always be an illicit market for cannabis, even though we intend to have it legalized through this framework. So it will provide that security and accountability. Secondly, it will allow for the auditing of the industry to satisfy the International Narcotics Control Board and international bodies. And thirdly, it will ensure that we can trace the quality, potency, and batches of cannabis that result in the final product. So there will be class 1 and class 2 cannabis, a stronger potency being class 2, lower potency being class 1. The seed to sale tracking platform would then as well be able to track potency of the various cannabis plants as well. So it will assist in that process, so we'll know exactly how much THC may be in each various plant. How will you be able to get cannabis? So the stronger potency I referred to as class 2, one would have to have a registered doctor give a prescription, and they can purchase it from a licensed pharmacy. However, if it is the lower potency class 1, it can be acquired from a registered dispensary without a prescription. Who will determine what is high potency and low potency? As I referred earlier to the advisory council, that council, which comprises of medical professionals, professionals in business, and from the RSA, will be the ones to determine what is the threshold for the class 1 and class 2 high or low potency cannabis. Does a dispensary have to be a pharmacy? So a dispensary only selling class 1 cannabis does not have to be a pharmacy, but if it's selling class 2 cannabis, it can sell class 1 and class 2, but once it includes class 2, which is the higher potency, it must be a licensed pharmacy. Will people be able to smoke anywhere? And the answer is no. Consistent now with cigarettes, for example. With cannabis, it must be a licensed place for smoking cannabis, where cannabis can be smoked. And of course, we just have that provision to appreciate that there are members of our society who do not want to be exposed to any type of smoke. And so we have to respect those rights, and we have designated places or in a private place, such as your home, where you can consume or smoke or vape cannabis. With respect to persons driving or working while under the influence of cannabis, similar to alcohol, you should not drive or operate any heavy equipment while under the influence of cannabis, because we appreciate in that state some persons may be mentally compromised, and so it will be an offense under the legislation if one were to operate heavy-duty equipment or vehicle while under the influence of cannabis. Again, we are taking into consideration the wider society and protecting lives and health and just ensuring that as a precaution.
So we've gone through a number of the licenses that are required under the regime. The question then comes to, will everybody require a license for every step of the cannabis regime? The Minister of Commerce has the power under the legislation I'll get to your question in 1 second. The Ministry of Commerce has the power under the legislation to exclude a certain class of products from requiring a license, both for importation and for dispensing. So we recognize that in some cases, there really are cannabis products that may not necessarily need the same level of scrutiny as other cannabis products. So by way of example, birdseed is made up primarily of hemp seed. It would not, to our minds, be proper to compel a pet store to obtain a license to import birdseed or to obtain a license to sell birdseed, recognizing it is a cannabis product. So the minister, if she so chooses, would have the ability under the legislation to deem that as a class of cannabis product that does not require a license for importation or sale. Similarly, you may have other products which may, your hemp shampoos, etc. If the minister sees fit, you may have these products sold in your larger retailers and not want to compel these retailers to get a license to dispense. Because if you compel them to get a license to dispense for a hemp shampoo, they are then in a position to dispense all Class 1 cannabis products. So instead of compelling them to get a license for some of these lower level cannabis products, the minister may, if she sees fit, indicate that these products or these classes of products will not require a license to be dispensed, which is to be sold, or to be imported into St. Lucia. You had a question?
Yeah, man. Before the selling of cannabis and free up and freedom and legalization and rarity, what will become of the cannabis prisoners? If the cannabis prisoners are not free, they're not going to legalize cannabis. They have to free the prisoners, the cannabis prisoners. What will become of them?
So the legislation as drafted, we spoke earlier of the amnesty for individuals who at the time of legalization can claim that they were involved in the industry, but that would be specifically for individuals who have not yet been arrested and charged. The powers that exist with regard to nolly-prosing or not prosecuting persons are still held by the Director of Public Prosecution. The power to act as the Governor General does with regard to his powers under the Constitution still remain. So it is a discussion that can be held, but it is not something that the bill treats with. It is something that the Constitution allows the Governor General to take action with regard to.
Yeah, just as a continuation to his question, would you have any idea of the status of, I remember the current Prime Minister mentioning about the expunging of records of previous cannabis offenders, can you speak to that as to what the status of that is right now?
So that amendment was passed some 2 to 3 years ago. And individuals who do have a conviction for cannabis because of the amendment can apply to have that record expunged. Yes. So we spoke earlier about obtaining your cannabis, whether it be Class 1 or Class 2, and spoke to the fact that the difference between Class 1 and Class 2 will be determined by the minister on the advice of the council. But we want to stress the entire regime that deals and treats with cannabis as proposed in this legislation is for medicinal cannabis. A medical practitioner can prescribe cannabis to anybody of any age if that medical practitioner is of the view that the individual can benefit from the cannabis use. That means that, yes, a 2-year-old child or a 60-year-old person can get a prescription for cannabis if it is that the medicinal practitioner is of the view that they have examined that patient and that patient can benefit from the use of that cannabis product. They will, in those circumstances, advise the caregiver or parent as to how it should be administered and give that person, who's listed as caregiver in the legislation, the ability to give that child a cannabis product. If it is that an individual wishes to obtain class 1 cannabis, which is the cannabis product that does not require a prescription, in order to self-prescribe, so to speak, that individual must be over the age of 21. So if that person is under the age of 21, they will require a prescription to access class 1 or class 2 cannabis, and they can do so at any age because a medical practitioner will advise you the terms on which you should be using the cannabis. Above the age of 21, you would still require a prescription for class 2 cannabis, but you would be able to access class 1 cannabis without a prescription from any class 1 dispensary. We want to also touch on, yes, go ahead.
Do we have professionals who examine cannabis to whoever they have to give it to?
I'm not sure I get your question.
Do we have like professionals like eligible to provide the
You mean the
substance?
doctors?
Yeah.
So yes, there are some doctors who have gone through, on their own, who have gone through the training in cannabis. It has not been, understanding it has been illegal hitherto. It has not been something that they have been mandated to receive training for. But we have had conversations with the Medical and Dental Council, who would have given the doctors the license to practice, and they are now looking into the various courses that would be available for your current medical practitioners to prescribe cannabis. I also am aware that the Pharmacy Association has already been looking at the regime, and they are also making strides to ensure that they themselves are also informed on how you go about with dispensing the cannabis that's prescribed.
And what's about like whoever who's dealing with cannabis who would like to be involved also to be like part of that program?
I'm not sure I follow. When you say whoever
Like
is involved.
people who want to be involved in that part of that program, want to be, example like, all right, I'm using brother for example. A man like him, he knows about cannabis, like for a long time, and he knows like certain stuff about healing because marijuana is an international herb, you know, and we just like getting into that in St. Lucia, you know, we just getting along. We have like the bigger worlds, America, England, Israel, all these places has been into cannabis for so long, and they has like prescribed drugs as cannabis, which people use, you know, like even in the elders who they use these things a lot, they consume it a lot, you know, it's therefore all sorts of stuff, you know, and
So if I'm not mistaken, you're referring to your herbal healers, the persons who are not necessarily medicinal practitioners licensed by the medical.
Yeah.
So there is a legislation that speaks to the abilities of some of these individuals currently. St. Lucia is one of the persons one of the countries rather in the forefront of that area, given that we have that legislation. But as I said, there's a conversation taking place with the Medical and Dental Council to see how we can allow for these persons to give some advice in that space.
okay, and since we just going into that stage, if we have that in a, I mean like in the way I could break it down, happening, that business of production of marijuana in St. Lucia going on, we could have impact on the nation in even like not really like promoting crime, but like dismantling crime in a lot of ways. You understand? For instance, we have in St. Vincent, you have like planters just growing, and you know it's a wide range of it's a different type of business down there in St. Vincent. Okay, well we're involved with nationwide, and there's not like us like to say like is much crime has been when it comes to like marijuana, you know. Yeah, so we might need a lot of elders also, like the brother the brother, what is he? He's not there again. You know, but we have elders, we have a lot of elders who can really deal with that kind of stuff. Okay?
All right, thanks for that. As I said, within the legislation, and as the corporate secretary referred to, within the legislation and the council specifically, there are individuals from the Rastafarian community who sit on that council who would be able to give that advice and those recommendations. So that exists, but thank you for that. I see we have a question in the Zoom platform asking what is the difference between Class 1 and Class 2 cannabis. So just to reiterate, Class 1 cannabis would have been the less potent cannabis. Class 2 cannabis would be the more potent cannabis. The difference between Class 1 and Class 2 will be determined by the minister on advice from the Medicinal Cannabis Advisory Council. All right?
My concern is what local products has came up for the RSC or the government about which class, which doesn't deserve a license, since St. Lucia want to be the leading countries when it comes to the cannabis products.
Could you ask that again?
What cannabis products that doesn't deserve a license? I guess the RSC or the government have an idea about what product that doesn't deserve a license.
So as I said earlier, the Minister of Commerce has the power in the legislation after having consultation with the RSC and with the Medicinal Cannabis Advisory Council to make that determination. So we cannot speak for the minister. There is also, as I said earlier, the Medicinal Cannabis Advisory Council. The technocrats and the other persons on that council will advise the minister which products may not require a license for importation or dispensing, and they will then have the minister act accordingly with an order to so dictate.
So does that mean this is going to take longer than we, the local planters and growers, anticipated? Because like I understood, they're trying to have that bill going for before the next general election.
So it would not change the timeline for the bill. So whether after the bill is passed, the council in the legislation will recommend to the minister that product and that product should not require a license to import. That does not change the timeline for the bill.
Wouldn't that still have to go back into cabinet and discuss?
No, but the legislation would still be in existence. The persons would still be allowed to cultivate. You'd still be allowed to, if you have a license, be deemed a traditional cultivator, to have a CTE, to have transportation licenses. All of those matters would still subsist. It would really come down to the minister at the time that she receives adequate instructions to make the order, which can happen at any point in time. And as we evolve within a cannabis space, there can be new products that come to the fore at any point in time. The minister can decide that do not require a dispensing license. So for example, if you have plastic chairs made of hemp, you may not want to require a license to sell a plastic chair made of hemp. There's hemp plastic that you can make chairs out of. The minister may indicate that you do not require a dispensary license for this product.
I understand, because the reason why I'm asking those questions, I've been into the cannabis products since 2014, and I've been doing my cannabis products abroad in the States. And my philosophy of it, the same law and legislation that's in Europe, America, and all over the Caribbean island is not going to be any different from St. Lucia. So I think there is something that is being held in back that we're not getting, or the proper guidelines, so we could do the work before those foreign investors come in and just take over us. That's just my concern.
So we will touch later on some of the points with regard to the foreign investors, but again, that is why St. Lucia has a piece of legislation that is different to all of the other jurisdictions. So nowhere else in the Caribbean or in the world, as we have seen, reviewing the legislation, has a central trading entity. And in conversations with the other islands that have legalized, they have looked at this model and looked at it and indicated that they would like to see similar models incorporated into their jurisdictions. Not all of the jurisdictions reference traditional cultivators, for example. You have some jurisdictions that do not recognize a traditional cultivator. So yes, you have a number of jurisdictions that have legalized. All of them have done it differently. There's no one shoe fits all in that space. In the case of countries like Barbados, for example, the flower is not allowed to be sold. So there's no smoking in their context at all. So I'm saying to you, yes, we recognize that there are lots of jurisdictions who have legalized. St. Lucia's legislation is different, and we believe that it is the reason we brought it to this forum and to forums similar to this, so you can advise as to whether you think that there's a need for us to change or tweak the legislation as we have drafted it. But we have also looked at what Jamaica has done, what Antigua has done, what St. Kitts is trying to do, what Barbados has done, what St. Vincent has done, what Grenada is proposing to do. They're all different, and we think that what we have done works for St. Lucia.
I understand, because all what we, the local planters, growers, jugglers need down is just the information to be one step of the game before those big guns come in. Because it's true.
That's why we're here.
It's true.
That's why we're here.
So if you know there's that planter who grows the strain, I think that is the time we should be working with them and telling them, okay, this is what to do, this is what to do. Because I would rather, I heard you mention something earlier on about 20% goes to the local stuff, to the local people because of the foreigners do have to come in. Supposing there's a local who have all the sort of resources.
But that's what I'm saying to you. It was a minimum number. So make sure that you listen to the entire statement. It is a minimum number. We would love to see the CTE made up of completely traditional cultivators or completely made up of St. Lucians. But we recognize if it is that there is a need to reach out to investors, because you need to be in a position to pay an individual for their cannabis immediately. In the current dispensation, when a cultivator sells their product, they get their money immediately. They don't wait 3 months to have that money released to them. So if you have a central trading entity, it must be in a position to pay to the cultivator immediately or within a short enough space of time. If you are unable as a group of traditional cultivators to raise that capital, you may require the assistance of investors. So that is why there's a minimum amount set so that if an investor does come to St. Lucia and they want to be a CTE, they must still have a conversation with a number of traditional cultivators and have them join the company or the cooperative before they can register as a central trading entity.
So that's why we, or me, people like me, who concerned about the figures, what are the figures? Because the RRC and the RSA and the government who have done the homework at the background do have a figure in mind. But if we don't have a figure in mind, we've been in the dark shade. So if we have a number that we're working with, there's at least 6 or 10 of us who come together and build something. As far as I know, there's a THC cooperative, and I'm on the outside of it. And there is not one thing they could convince me to be part of that cooperative. Is there anything the RSA have been doing to recognize that THC cooperative?
Well, keep in mind the legislation has not been passed. So the RSA's mandate right now is to look to see what is happening within the space and see that we can develop a piece of legislation that works best for St. Lucia, and to engage yourself and other persons in that discussion. If it is that you believe that you can reach out to a number of persons and form a proper central trading entity, the RSA will not fight that. We are a regulator. We are not going to step into the space and say to, you refer to the THC, that the THC needs to have more members or less members, or the THC cannot get a no, that's not for us to determine. If the application comes in, we will review the application, see if they meet the criteria, and if they do, they will be given the license to serve as a central trading entity. If they do not meet the criteria, they may not be able to serve as a central trading entity. So it is for you to have a discussion with the other cultivators, the other jugglers, the other producers, to determine what you want to do and if you can serve as a central trading entity. That is not for us to prohibit or to encourage.
I've been doing that inside the THC group. I don't know if anybody who recognizes me inside the THC group, Philo St. Lucia, and I've been asking the hardcore questions. And Pancho is the only one who's been answering, and which I know there's members who's been on that board who've been going to other officials' meetings, and they've just been silenced.
Well, we can't speak to what's happening internally with the THC, and we wouldn't want to do that in this forum. So I would ask you not to go into what's happening internally within the THC. All I can say is, if an entity applies for a central trading entity license and they meet the criteria, they will obtain that license. All right? Yes, so we have 2 questions online. What means of security does a cannabis grower need? So the regulations for the cultivators have already started being developed, but we need first to determine what would be agreed to in the legislation, because obviously you would appreciate that what goes into your regulations is informed by what is in your legislation. And as soon as we are in a position to crystallize the bill, we will be in a position to release the regulations for similar review by the public so persons can see what are the regulations for a class 1 dispensary, a class 2 dispensary, for cultivation, for security, for transportation. All of these matters are couched within regulations. Some 17 have been drafted, but we need first to have the bill crystallized, even if it is not passed, but finished to a point where we can now release regulations and have a discussion on them. There's another question, says, what is the function of the standards of Bureau position in terms of good agricultural practices? So we'll speak a little bit later on the roles and responsibilities of all the other governmental organizations, but the Bureau of Standards, safe to say, would have the same responsibility it has now with regard to standards in St. Lucia generally. And that would be to set any standard for any aspect of life in St. Lucia, including within the cannabis space. Can the CTE be a dispensary as well, or would it need a license for both? So we'll touch on that point as well a little later, but the CTE automatically is the holder of a license to import, to export, and to package cannabis that it purchases, but it will not be within the space outside of that. The members of the CTE may also obviously have their cultivation license because they are required to be the traditional cultivators, but the CTE itself will not be cultivating or have a license for cultivation. So just to go back to the point we were making earlier on the prescribing of the cannabis class 2 and class 1, you also have within the cannabis space internationally a trend towards synthetic cannabis. So some persons who realized that cannabis, the plant, was illegal, and by virtue of it, the various leaves and plants, and flowers and various aspects of the plant were illegal, use some biochemical processes and chemical processes to create cannabinoids. In doing so, they were hoping to have flouted the legislation that they never cultivated cannabis plants or had cannabis plants. Sufficient training has not been done on the creation of these cannabinoids, and sufficient research has not been done on the effects of these synthetic cannabinoids. As such, synthetic cannabis and cannabis products are banned for importation and for use in St. Lucia. We will only be allowing the actual plant and the products produced from the actual plant. So just to touch on the point that was raised earlier about the CTE license a little more. The central trading entity, yes, it will be allowed to purchase cannabis from the cultivators. It will not be allowed to be a cultivator, but it can also import cannabis and cannabis products, which will include the seeds and other products that they can then sell to dispensaries. If they are able and they have the markets, they can also export the cannabis products to any willing market. But outside of the importation, the sale to dispensaries, the exportation, and the purchase from the licensed cultivators, the CTE will not have any other abilities and will not be allowed a license to interact in the cannabis industry otherwise. A lab that is licensed under this legislation, well, this proposed legislation, will not be allowed to have a license for any other activity under the cannabis regime. So you will not be able to be a cultivator and a lab testing the cannabis itself, or a lab testing and a dispensary. If you are a lab, that will be the sole function that you can hold within the cannabis space. So the Regulated Substances Act of 2023, as I said earlier, is what created the RSA. In that legislation, it references inspectors as a specific office. The inspectors, or as we refer to them now within the RSA, your field officers, are individuals tasked with being our eyes and ears on the ground at the RSA. So the field officers will receive an application that somebody has submitted to the RSA. They will be responsible for visiting the dispensary or visiting the proposed area for a farm, having discussions with the applicant for a cultivation license, liaising with the other governmental organizations to ensure that they can facilitate as much as possible the applicant. If the license is approved, they will also be the ones responsible for doing the spot checks on these farms or these dispensaries or producers, being there when they have to harvest, ensuring that they have the adequate support throughout the space so that they can inform the RSA of any challenges that an applicant is facing or that a licensee is facing.
Yeah, sorry, let me ask you a question since you mentioned the application. When I browsed through the bill, it spoke of the specific requirements to, for example, being a cultivator, like location, fencing, etc. With any other business entity in St. Lucia, at least that I know of, one can start a business even without having a location or any of the requirements. They can register the business and begin their plan to execute. Reading the bill, it seems like you would have had to have all the requirements before you can even apply to get the license. That's what it seems like to me. So like, for example, let's say I don't have any farmland, but I want to be a cultivator, whereas it comes across like I need to purchase farmland or own farmland first before I can apply. Whereas when you look at it on a business side, why would I do all that investment to eventually possibly be told we're saturated with the amount of persons who are cultivating, we can't give you a license?
Okay, so you do not have to show that you have the land, but what you will have to be able to show is that you have permission to, or you have the ability to acquire the land. So you have engaged somebody who's willing to lease you the land. You have engaged with Crown Lands to have a discussion about that parcel of land that you will have access to. What you would have to satisfy the RSA is that you have the ability to meet the requirements for that license. And thereafter, since you have a license, if you are unable to meet the terms of that license, it can always be revoked.
Right, okay.
But you do not necessarily have to show, if you do have the land, all well and good, but if it is that you have an agreement for sale that you're going to acquire that land, that would suffice as well.
All right, one other thing that you probably may not know, but well, I know you're a very informed person. I remember when St. Vincent started their cultivation, with medicinal marijuana, for example, it has to be organic. And a lot of the land that were pre-marijuana grown before, the soil was tainted with inorganic material. Is that one of the things that has to be required in order for you to get the license, or after you get the license to continue moving forward? Because I know in St. Lucia there is a lot of farmland right now that if you were to test the soil, there's a lot of chemicals that would make growing marijuana in that soil inorganic.
So again, you're referencing things that will be placed within the regulations or guidelines, but the bill itself will not restrict the land and require that it be organic. It's not the case in St. Vincent either. The legislation itself doesn't speak to that. So it would be a conversation that we can have at the point in time that we get to the regulations as to how we would deal and treat with that matter.
Let me just push that across. So in the class 1 and class 2, so that will be like a grade. A grade of class 1 is the one that has the less potency, right? So that production, that will go into production of like, as you mentioned earlier, shampoos, products like
No, not
oil.
necessarily. So we do not know what the potency level will be.
Because class 2 of high THC cannot produce this kind of stuff. It have to be of the lower class.
But that's what I'm saying to you. We do not know what the threshold will be. So we're not in a position to dictate if the Medicinal Cannabis Advisory Council will specify that 20% THC is the threshold, in which case you have persons who consume 20% THC flower. So you may have that, and I don't want to at this stage preempt the Medicinal Cannabis Advisory Council and say that it's going to be 0.03%. It may be 30%, it may be 5%, we don't know.
Yes, and in the cultivation of marijuana, there is male and female. Now, being with female is the one that produces the THC. The male is the one that produces the less, okay? Mm-hmm. Then you have the products made from the male. More of the products of like you use, like I would even consider like even like medical marijuana also, it goes into class of the male, you know? Yeah, and the THC, which as you say, I don't know like whatever they're going to test it as, it goes into medical marijuana also. Now in St. Lucia, you mentioned of our grounds. We have a lot of untouched grounds, that's virgin grounds. And a lot of the people or foreigners, many of them know we produce very good stuff because our land is virgin soil, okay? We have what's in chemical, but you turn over the land and you could get that organized and still turn it back into, because it's that's how it replenishes itself, the land. Okay? Yeah. So these what we have here, the people will be looking for strong marijuana. A lot of the
But again, that's what I'm saying to you. I don't think it's wise to go too much into strong marijuana because we do not know what is class 1 and class 2. So when the legislation is passed, we will then know class 1 and class 2. We are not in a position to talk right now about the strong marijuana because the difficulty...
Well, that's you have to give it in like in just a raw, like, you know.
No, but you see, what you're referring to as strong marijuana may still be class 1. And that's what I'm trying to explain to you.
I do feel so. Strong marijuana cannot be into.
But we cannot
like,
say because we do not know what is strong marijuana right now. The individuals on the street who go and say I want strong marijuana do not know what they are getting.
Well, we know. I'm not telling you about everybody. You understand? But that is how it is. It's THC found in the higher or the
so
highest
what is the
potency.
percentage? What is the percentage?
The percentage?
Yes, for strong marijuana.
Limitless.
But that's what I'm saying to you. The person who right now goes into Barron's Drive in Soufriere and says that I want strong marijuana, and the juggler who gives that person strong marijuana, we do not know what that is. And you do not know if it is 16%, if it is 20% THC in the flower. The person who has the cannabis tincture or oil that they're using that says, I want that strong thing, we do not know what it is. We are accustomed to saying, I want strong weed. But we do not know if the strong weed you are using now is 18% flower and that satisfies you.
I understand.
So that's what I'm saying to you. Do not now say that strong weed will be what this and so. We don't know. When the Medical Advisory Council meets, they have persons on that council who are Rastafarian, who the Medical and Dental Association, your CMO, and they will sit down and discuss, okay, we are looking at this amount to distinguish it in your class 1 and class 2.
To reach their standards.
So there's no more strong marijuana. There is class 1 and class 2. We will know what class 1 and class 2 is when the Minister of Commerce specifies this is the distinction. I have been advised by that group of persons. And the reason it is not within the bill is because the minister can, as she continues to receive advice from the from the Medicinal Cannabis Advisory Council, change that figure. So if it is that we realize that it is too low, she can change it. If it is that she realizes it is too high and the persons are not pleased with the strength of that potency, it can be lowered. So what we want to understand from you is if you are okay with the legislation that creates that mechanism, if you are okay with the mechanism, then we need to trust that the advisory council will do its work and advise the minister adequately. But I cannot now speak to the mail plan, which is that's something that we have to wait until the advisory council advises the minister.
Yeah, good evening. Will the regulation have a specific quantity for the cultivators?
So the cultivators will apply for licenses based on the space that they want to cultivate in. So if it is that you're saying, I would like to have a farm of 1 acre, then there would have been a tier for 1 acre or lower, 1 acre to 5 acres, 5 acres to 10 acres, depending on the space that you want to cultivate in. All right.
As I would have referenced earlier, we do recognize the Rastafarian community in the bill. So all religious organizations, approved religious organizations, can apply for the various licenses in the bill. We appreciate that Rastafarians as a religion seem to be the formidable ones that, do use cannabis, etc. So that would apply to them. As well, the Rastafarian community would use cannabis for sacramental purposes. So separate and apart from commercial activity, they would be able to utilize cannabis for sacramental purposes. So how that would work is, remember I referenced the C2 sale platform, which would be tracking all cannabis from the time it is grown to when it is sold. So that cannabis for sacramental purposes would have to be noted, registered, that the reason why it was not sold to the CTE, it is because that specific amount, for example, from farmer A, was used for sacramental purposes. Because otherwise, all of the cannabis will be tracked. And that is why it will be very difficult to introduce cannabis from the illicit market into the legal market, because the software would have noted that it was not grown by a licensed farmer. So that as well would help, again, in the security of the regime as well. If there may be predial larceny, then it would have been, for example, stolen from a farmer who has a license, and then they're trying to introduce it again to the legal market. It would be recognized that it was from farmer B, and so that was stolen. So just a further expansion there. As well, we want to note the role of other government bodies and statutory entities, that it will be maintained. So be very clear, the RSA, whereas we are regulating the cannabis industry, you're applying for licenses, we're ensuring the conditions are being maintained. All other roles that current government entities have, they would be retained. So for example, if there is theft of cannabis, because it would be legal if you have a license to cultivate, then as per any current crop, cucumbers, tomatoes, anything else, then you would make a report to the police. And they would take that report, they would investigate because you are cultivating legally. If you're importing your cannabis seeds, perhaps there may be duties applicable to those seeds. Customs would still apply those duties. Going back to agriculture, you are a legitimate farmer if you are planting cannabis with a license. As a result, if there is any, for example, a storm or any other natural disaster that impacts your cannabis, the same sort of assistance that they would give to other farmers in the time of loss of their crops, etc., then they would also render the same to you as well. If they are giving certain concessions, certain drip lines, or fertilizers, or whatever else for other farmers, you can then, with your license, say to agriculture, can I also benefit from this? And you should be able to as well. So just note that all of these other entities will still continue to serve you as legitimate cannabis farmers licensed in that space as well.
And just to touch on that point a little more, we recognize that the individuals who have been cultivating cannabis have had to go through great lengths to ensure that it was far from the eyes of the police. Many of these individuals are cultivating in the forest reserve. We do appreciate that these persons may be able to obtain the amnesty, and they may also be able to be seen as traditional cultivators. But we as the RSA and the legislation being proposed cannot empower you to stay in the forest reserve. A piece of legislation deems the forest reserve as a restricted area, and you're not allowed to go in there, and we cannot empower you so to do. So what would have to happen in that case is the individual who receives the amnesty, who is deemed a traditional cultivator, who wants to apply for a license to cultivate, would have to reach out to an individual who owns property, use property that they have, or have a conversation with Crown Lands to look at property that may be available for cultivation. And that's why we spoke earlier about the roles of other governmental organizations. Right now, there is a challenge with a farmer who's cultivating cannabis going to Crown Lands and saying, I'd like an acre of land to cultivate cannabis. But with this regime in place, the same responsibility that Crown Lands has to engage farmers who want to acquire or lease property for them to cultivate bananas, for them to cultivate other crops, the same ability now exists for your cannabis cultivators who have been deemed traditional cultivators or otherwise and want to approach Crown Lands for them to get land to cultivate cannabis because it's agricultural land that they're seeking to acquire. Similarly, the restrictions that the other governmental organizations would have had on the processes remain. The corporate secretary spoke earlier about customs. You also have within the Ministry of Health, your drug inspectors. These individuals have been given by these pieces of legislation certain rights and responsibilities. It is not because one has a license to import cannabis that when you import cannabis, the drug inspector will not similarly have the ability to go to vet that you are bringing in the product you said you were bringing in, even though you have that license to import. So we want to stress on persons that having the ability to get a license for cannabis does not mean that no other governmental organization can cause you to be in consistent stance with their piece of legislation. And you should, when trying to apply for a license along the cannabis space, ensure that you meet the requirements not just of the cannabis legislation, but the Inland Revenue legislation, for example, NIC if you have staff. all of these pieces of legislation and the requirements under these pieces of legislation will subsist. So what, we have a question?
I just want to ask something about the curing and also for the traditional farmers. I just follow a lot of the Americans and the Europeans, the way they grow and stuff. So for traditional farmers, I see that when you have like you have Americans, you have foreigners farmers coming in, that the way they will be curing, they will be basically flushing the product, they will be curing between 50 to 60% humidity, they will basically keeping the taste, flavor, all those things will be there. Now, traditional farmers cure the normal way of you just hang it and wait for it to dry and then you basically bag it up. Would there be training for them so that they don't get basically pushed out by the investors? Because the investors' product will basically have a lot of bag appeal. Now, you have products like seeds like wedding cake, you have OG Kush. Would they have also would they have anything in the regulation basically to when farmers create new strains that it will be registered and it will be known for that this is St. Lucia? Like you have the Humble Seed Company, you have Seedsman, you know that those places that those certain strains come from. Would we have those kind of regulations here for us?
So again, anybody who's cultivating cannabis would either have to have started off with seeds or having gotten a mother plant, be doing grafts of that mother plant and clones. We as the RSA, as regulators, are not going to compel you to act in a certain way with regard to how you decide to cultivate, as long as you are consistent with the standards. So if you recognize, for example, that you want to propagate seeds and you have a cultivator's license, you can cultivate for seeds. That's fine. You meet the requirements for your cultivation license. You are cultivating the plant only for the seeds. That's okay. We are not going to say, well, after the third cultivator that has been giving a license, we're not going to give any more cultivation licenses until somebody applies to be a licensee only for seeds. If you want to be an importer and import seeds, that is also fine. We would encourage persons as much as possible to develop these fresh strains that are not available elsewhere in the world, but we will not compel the cultivators in St. Lucia and say that you cannot cultivate the strains that already exist. If it is as a business person, as a prudent business person, you decide you want to distinguish your brand and distinguish your product, we'd encourage that. Obviously, we want to ensure that the persons who are utilizing our product see it as a different or a niche product, because they can get the OG Kush in other places. They can get the AK-47 in other places. But will they be able to get your strain in another place? And you would have to make the determination if you want to develop your strain that they cannot get in another place.
Now, you could have those strains, but it always comes down to the curing. Now, if you have to watch the way that those investors, the way that they cure the product with those big farms, it might create a problem for us, for the normal way we just basically cure our product.
I disagree, and I will say this to you. The product that they're curing and that they have available, you would be surprised to note that just in the treatment of your cannabis, you now have a cannabis that is a niche product. So you have authentic Caribbean cannabis or authentic Rastafarian cannabis. And that may be something that a tourist coming down to St. Lucia will say, I don't want the product that I know I can get in that space. I prefer to get the authentic Rastafarian cannabis. And I want to know that it was hung in this way and done in that way. You know, that it is sun-bathed cannabis. These are things that we expect the persons in the industry to capitalize on. But as an RSA, as a regulator, we will not say to you that you must do it in this way or that way, as long as you meet the standards established by the regulations and the Bureau of Standards. All right, so.
We want that kind of thing. We want that kind of product. We want the product from St. Lucia. We don't want the one we have in America. We want the one St. Lucia has. Right. Okay, that is what they will be asking for, you know. Now, we importing our seeds, because we're going to have like some license to import the seeds, right?
Yes, an importer can import seeds.
Now, anytime you import seeds and you plant seeds, it always loses a certain potency, but the potency it loses, it doesn't have the original one, but it develops a different type of when you're planting it. Mm-hmm. You understand? So that is where I agree with you, you know, in the, okay? So we're on the right track.
Thanks for that. So,
let me ask a question on her behalf. She mentioned that, for example, right now you have individuals on the side of the road, for example, selling cigarettes, among other things, and you could go there and buy a 5 bag or 10 or whatever. She's wondering, how would it affect people like these? Would they be able to get a license, or would they be able to do something like, you know, you go to a gas station, you buy a pack of cigarettes, and you come on the side and you sell singles? Is there any thing?
So anybody who is selling or dispensing rather cannabis would require a license for it. So they would have to meet the regulations that speak to a class 1 dispensary. As the corporate secretary said earlier, a class 2 dispensary in the legislation is required to be a pharmacy. A class 1 dispensary is not. We have developed regulations with regard to the class 1 dispensaries, and we will be in a similar forum as this, discuss what these requirements will be and determine if they have to be tweaked accordingly. But anybody who is selling cannabis would require a license to sell cannabis.
So it won't be like right now. So for example, right now I'd need a license to import alcohol or cigarettes, for example. But individuals on the side of the road will go and purchase cigarettes and alcohol and open a tray, pay their $5 for the day, and sell alcohol and cigarettes, smaller portions. So she's wondering, would that be allowed without a license?
No, so anybody who is selling cannabis, anybody dispensing cannabis products will require a license.
So then I guess with the next, when you all have the session for class 1, you all will be able to tell us if someone can get a license if they have a tray on the side of the road to sell marijuana.
All of the regulations with regard to not just the dispensaries, but transportation licenses, your sacramental use, all of these regulations will be released as soon as we have finished this bill.
Okay, good evening, everybody. I'm not sure if you already spoke to, I think you did say that there is no maximum or minimum amount of land space that you would need to cultivate. So does the legislation speak to where you can where you can cultivate? Let's say, for example, I have like an extra 5,000 square feet of land in a residential area. Can I decide, okay, I'm going to?
That's a good question. So the regulations speak to some of these restrictions. Off the top of my head, I know that it's not supposed to be visible from the public space, so you shouldn't be able to walk on the side of the road and see it. But I do not believe that there is a restriction with regard to it being in as a residential space. There is, to my mind, also a restriction with it being close to a school, though. Yeah, so there is a restriction for how close it is to a school, and it ought not to be visible from outside. Yeah, so those are the two restrictions that I remember off the top of my head. We also saw a question with regard to the training for the farmers. So again, as the regulators, we would be ensuring that the persons have received a license if they meet the criteria for a license. But we are working with the various stakeholders, and we have meetings after this meeting with your ministries of agriculture, education, etc., to have discussions on how they would be part of this industry. So similar to the processes where exports and the Ministry of Agriculture and the extension officers assist with training for your CMOS farmers and your banana farmers, we would hope and expect that the Ministry of Agriculture would similarly assist with training for the various components of the cannabis industry. So what happens next? We have disseminated this bill through the length and breadth of the island. It has been made available online. We've had a number of similar engagements to this in Vieux-Fort, in Gros-Islet, in Dennery, in Ancillary, in Soufrière, really to ensure that persons, one, understand what is within the bill, and two, get an opportunity to critique it. Let us know what their thoughts are, what their concerns are, any comments that they have that we should look to incorporate into the legislation. Or possibly, if it's not in the legislation, within the regulations that will come after the legislation has been completed. So after we have completed this process with the public stakeholder engagements, we will be having meetings as early as next week with stakeholders. from your Christian Council and your Ainola Council for the Advancement of Rastafarianism, all the way down to your Invest St. Lucia and your Export St. Lucia. We will be speaking to all of these stakeholders, your Youth Council and your Citizenship by Investment, all of these entities, so they understand, and the business community as well, so that they understand what is coming, similar to this forum, so that the regular person understands what is coming within the legislation. These are stakeholders will have an opportunity to similarly critique it and see whether they have some concerns with what is being proposed in the legislation. After we have gone through that iterative process with them, some of the comments will be incorporated into the bill. And that is why this forum and these other forums are important, because the comments coming from these settings will then inform the considerations of changes to the legislation. After we have completed the changes to the legislation, we will then be sending this bill to the Cabinet of Ministers for onward processing at the Cabinet level. And if it is approved by the Cabinet of Ministers, it will then be laid in Parliament for enactment of the Cannabis and Industrial Hemp Bill. So I want to encourage persons who have not yet sent in comments, who have not yet read the bill, who have either online today or who have been in the room, to go to the RSA website, to go to the Ministry of Commerce website, to go to the Bureau of Standards website. So you can send us an email to info@rsa.govt.lc and we will send you a copy of the bill. If you prefer a physical copy, you can come to our office at the SLBS building and we will furnish you with a hard copy of the bill so you can review. As we understand, some people prefer to have a physical copy to review. We really want to encourage persons to take the time. It is a somewhat lengthy bill at 126 pages, but every part of our society will be touched by this piece of legislation. And even if you are not a cannabis user, you may have family that would benefit from its use, but will be affected by its use. So it's wise to my mind that you are informed as to what the bill allows for, what is prohibited, what are the offenses, what you can do, so you can determine if you want to reach out to us at this stage to tweak and make sure it is best suited for St. Lucia. We have looked to see what exists in Jamaica, in St. Kitts, what is being discussed now in Dominica, what is being drafted now in Grenada. We have taken all that into consideration. But all of these countries are not St. Lucia. And we believe this bill is best suited for the St. Lucian experiment and the St. Lucian context. So we need the advice from you as the people on the street, the people who will be part and parcel of the industry. What should we change, if anything? What needs to be tweaked? What is good to your mind? And with that information, we will incorporate it into the bill if we see merit in it, and that bill will become the piece of legislation that the parliamentarians will give assent to and become the piece of legislation that governs the cannabis industry. So I will thank you again for coming and open the floor to any remaining questions that we may have.
Yes, as you mentioned, it would probably be preferable to have the hard copy of the bill to go through. So currently, are there any places where the hard copy can be accessed? Like for example, would there be one at the Central Library, institutions like that where people could access, you know?
Okay, so we do not have one at the Central Library, but we'll take that recommendation.
Where can we get it right now?
As I said earlier, it's available at our office at the St. Lucia Bureau of Standards, so you can visit us in BZ and we will furnish you with a physical copy of the bill. I see a question in the group asking, will the public see the final proposed bill before it is passed? And yes, we will similarly publish that bill before it is sent to Parliament for enactment.
Because we want to be innovative too, you know. When we learn of what other countries has been doing, yeah, we'll learn from them, but we want to be innovative to our own growing of our marijuana. Okay? Now you said earlier we're going to have like something like a lab, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now I saw you at the CBD. Mm-hmm. The CBD, yeah, the CBD is one of the stuff that you get the medicines from, and which I find that would be very important in St. Lucia for St. Lucians, because we are a bit far from that. We are a bit far from getting this stuff going in St. Lucia. So I thank you all for producing that. We're supposed to be in that long time ago already, but true, I don't know if it's like the leaders, you know, and stuff like it have to be because, you know, that's supposed to be on the floor already because it's a millionaire in industry. What no, that cannabis production. Okay, yeah. So I thank you all for one and all.
Thanks for that. So we have another question on the Zoom platform. Can I register an LLC and break it down into small businesses, so planting, processing, and selling? So yes, an individual can apply for a full suite of licenses that will allow for the cultivation, the processing, and the dispensing of cannabis. You can do so if you so please. If you want to register them as separate entities, you're also free to do so. Any other questions?
Yeah, I would just like to know if, well, not like to know if, but I would like for on your part that you could do the best you can, because you know in St. Lucia there are lots of people who their livelihood depends on cultivating marijuana, the cultivation of marijuana. In spite of it's not probably a huge percent of the population, but there is a great percent of this population that their livelihood, feeding their children, sending their kids to school, their livelihood depends on this. Okay? It's a fact. But you know, with the legalization and that there will be an influx of foreign investors. So I would like for you all to, on your part, do everything to protect the people, the local people of this country.
Okay, so thanks for that.
That the money gods don't run a monopoly and push the local people out.
Yeah, so thanks for that. And again, that is why we have the central trading entity.
Yes, I understand with the 20%.
So again, the minimum of 20%, we are encouraging persons, if they are so minded, to come together and form a central trading entity. We'd love to see 100% ownership of central trading of traditional cultivators forming a central trading entity. And keep in mind that if you have the investors who come to St. Lucia and they want to take part in the industry, and you would not have been a cultivator, but you would have been in another aspect of the cannabis space. So you were selling cannabis, for example. You still have the opportunity to be regarded as a traditional cultivator. And you still, as a member of a CTE, can benefit from these persons who come in, even if you're no longer within the cannabis space. So somebody who, for example, as you were asking earlier, somebody who has a mall right now, who says that I'm in the cannabis space, they can get their license as get the amnesty still. They can then be deemed a traditional cultivator. And as a traditional cultivator, they can register to be part of a CTE. And even if they decide they don't want to sell cannabis going forward, every time a plant is propagated in St. Lucia, they will still be able to benefit, because the funds paid into the CTE are funds that will be for its ownership and members. So we try to create that mechanism to ensure that the individuals who may still feel that, okay, the cost of investment for me to go into a farm may be a little bit prohibitive, but I'm a traditional cultivator. And you then have the opportunity, even without being part of the industry, to still benefit from what happens in the industry 10 and 30 and 40 years from now as a traditional cultivator.
Yeah, because we see this in business every time. You know, foreign investors would come in with the bulk of money. They would purchase a huge portion of land, import their own workers, their own seeds, their own everything, the machine, everything top class. And it would be very hard for we the locals to compete with them.
And that's why we want to give this special treatment.
Spending money.
But that's again why we give this special treatment. So we do not know what the license fees will be as yet, but I spoke earlier to the concessionary treatment to the traditional cultivators. So if it is, for example, and I'm not saying that will be the case in St. Lucia. In the case of St. Vincent, the traditional cultivator's license is $100. Whereas $100 is what St. Vincent charges for the traditional cultivator's license. Whereas a company that wants to cultivate on 2 or 3 acres of land in St. Vincent may be paying upwards of $50,000 and $60,000 US. So you realize the difference in treatment with traditional cultivators versus the companies that come in. So you're not trying to prevent them from coming in, but you want to give the leg up to the traditional cultivators, and that is why it is important for persons to recognize the need to come forward to say, I want to be a traditional cultivator. So you have that special power that ends after that amnesty period, but you now can get your license for a concessionary rate. You now are more attractive in this space. And if I am a cannabis processor, as opposed to getting a license for $200,000 US, which some licenses go up to, as opposed to buying a license in Jamaica, in California, you have licenses for $250,000 US. As opposed
Yeah,
to
because
as opposed to, if I may, as opposed to paying that price, I would prefer to allow a cultivator who's paying $500, $1,000 for his license to cultivate for me, because the price point of his cannabis is going to be less than me paying $250,000 US and also having to invest in my operation. So it's trying to make it more attractive for these individuals to go to the traditional cultivators to farm for them. And even if they're not so willing, you still benefit from being part of a CTE. So even if they say, I'm willing to pay the $250,000 US, I have that money. When they propagate the cannabis in St. Lucia, if you are a traditional cultivator and you are the member of a CTE, every single cannabis plant that is grown in St. Lucia you benefit from. And that is something that only St. Lucia has. So that's why I'm saying to you, we've worked very hard to develop this piece of legislation as a bespoke piece of legislation. It's special only to St. Lucia. And we have other jurisdictions that have come to us and said, can we look at what you have done? Because they recognize that they've had some of these same challenges. So it will not be perfect, but we are trying with mechanisms like this to assist in that regard.
One thing, I hope we do get this kind of license. We want a license like St. Vincent, you know, $100, $200. We don't know nothing about this kind of thing. Now, you see the $250,000, there is places that have millions of people. So these people could say $1 million, $500,000, you understand? And we want to be self-sufficient in our stuff. That is the thing that will keep us on top and keeping us enduring.
Question for you. So, a traditional cultivator, is it going to be seen as an individual or a company?
So a traditional cultivator can only be an individual or a religious organization.
Okay.
So a company cannot be a traditional cultivator.
All right. So if someone who is not a traditional cultivator, can they partner with a traditional cultivator to start a company that is co-founded by a traditional cultivator to get the traditional cultivator?
So as it stands now, the traditional cultivator is only an individual or a religious organization. So a tabernacle can come to say that this tabernacle wants to apply for a traditional cultivator's license in the current draft. If it is that there's an interest in allowing for traditional cultivators to form companies for cultivation, then that's a recommendation that you can make, and we will take that recommendation and see how it can be incorporated in the bill. But as it stands now, it is only for individuals.
So how do I make that recommendation?
So you can send us an email to info@rsa.govt.lc.
Okay. Can I get a copy of the presentation?
Copy of the presentation. We'll have a conversation after the
Okay.
Yes, so it is on Zoom, and it will also be live on YouTube, and there will be a YouTube link that will make the entire viewing of this evening's proceedings available to you.
Hi, good evening. First, I'd like to commend the work that you guys have done by the RSA and putting regulations in place before we start to embark on selling, cultivating, and producing marijuana products legally. My main concern is this, right? A lot of legislation has been passed in our country for a number of years, and a lot of them has not been maintained or regulated. So with this bill and this regulation that you're about to propose, my thing is, do you all have the capacity to ensure that those regulations are maintained and regulated over the years, and that things don't just go by the wayside? People start doing things what they want, how they want, and you don't have persons and institutions in place to ensure that persons follow the law.
Okay, so the board of the RSC has been working diligently since June last year to ensure that we have a proper framework in place, not just for the legislation, but for the enforcement of the legislation. So we do have an appreciation as to what is required by way of the number of field officers, by way of the number of compliance officers, and the corporate structure that would lend support to the industry that we are proposing. Obviously, there are very often resource constraints that the country is met with, but our hope is that we will be in a position to meet that full criteria of persons, and with that staff complement in place, we are confident we will be able to police the industry.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. The first one about the license. I haven't seen the bill yet. I know you just mentioned that the fees are not set yet, but I was thinking that the license could be a potential hindrance for, let's say, the common man getting into the industry and reaping the benefits. So I was just asking if you could maybe have a guesstimate as to what the cost would be, and also speak to the process of applying for the license. How does that work? And yeah, you could tackle that now, and then I'll ask the other question after.
Okay, so we do not have, as you put it, a guesstimate. We have seen the wide range that exists in the Caribbean and the wide range that exists internationally. So we would, as we did for this bill, not just be leaning on what takes place in Jamaica, what takes place in St. Vincent, but look to see on the ground what can work for St. Lucia. So that's an exercise that's ongoing, but as soon as we do have these figures, we would be making them public. With regard to the applications, it would depend on the license that you're applying for. So every single license has its own criteria. There will be regulations to inform every single license. So let's say you're applying for a transportation license for cannabis. So you would well understand that cannabis is a valuable commodity. So we wouldn't expect an individual to throw, you know, $100,000 worth of cannabis in the back of a pickup and drive it from Vieux-Fort to let's say, cul-de-sac where a CTE may be located.
Somebody might set up a roadblock.
So the legislation speaks to a transportation license, because we intend to have conversations with the insurance council and insurance companies to ensure that when you have caused a licensed transporter to take your product, it can benefit from similar insurance as your cash in transit. But for us to do that, we must ensure that we have a criteria set for those licenses so that the insurance council and the insurance companies can feel satisfied that you have met the criteria, so I can now insure that vehicle or the product in that vehicle or the amount of the product in that vehicle. So that's why the regulations are very important, and that's why the discussions, not just with the public, but with the stakeholders, is also important.
Okay, so yeah, my second question has to do with like in a legalized market, avenues for employment opportunities within the sector. Can you say if I don't know if there'll be a separate, maybe a separate government department created dealing with the cannabis industry, or if that comes under the Commerce, Ministry of Commerce or what, but I was just thinking in terms of employment opportunities just in general in the industry. What are the potential for that?
So as I said earlier, all the government agencies that have certain responsibilities in the space will maintain that. So many of you would know about the Youth Employment Agency. The Youth Employment Agency will still have the ability to assist a young person who wants to get into the cannabis industry. If they want to get into processing, they want to have a dispensary, they can still go to the Youth Employment Agency and say, I would like to get support in that area. If it is that you're a manufacturer and you need concessions to bring in your packaging or your raw materials, the Ministry of Commerce assists manufacturers. So you can go to the Ministry of Commerce and say, I would need assistance to get a concession so that I can bring in my raw materials. If you are a cannabis cultivator, you're a farmer. You can speak to an extension officer in that space, get recognized as a farmer if you meet that criteria, and then you can apply for the same treatment as another farmer, an FAR pickup, and other things that the Ministry of Agriculture already does and already permits for farmers. So there are mechanisms in place. The persons within the cannabis space have not been able to benefit from them because they were dealing with an illegal product. When you are licensed within that space, you can then go through all of the legitimate means that have been available to all the other persons before the legislation was allowed. So that's why I'm trying to reiterate to persons. Do not think that the RSA is going to be the one-stop shop giving you all of these things. The RSA is a regulator. You will apply for a license, we will determine if you meet the criteria, and we will give you a license if you meet that criteria. But if you then need assistance as a manufacturer, Right now, manufacturers who need assistance go through the regular mechanisms that exist and they get that assistance. If it is that you want the MSME loan grant for small businesses, the Ministry of Commerce has been running that now for over a year. So individuals can go to the Ministry of Commerce, apply for the MSME loan grant, and say that I'm a manufacturer within the cannabis space. I've applied for my license and I've received my provisional license, etc., for me to go into manufacturing of cannabis products. That is now allowed. So you do have that opportunity.
Yeah, and something that just came to mind, I think that was totally missed in the whole presentation tonight, the aspect of education. So will there be any amendments to, like, let's say, the education curriculum as it is right now, to incorporate, you know, education about cannabis in general and all that kind of thing? You know, I think the populace, by and large, is very much unaware of, I mean, we inside here know what's going on, and maybe people in the Zoom land, but I think generally there needs to be some sort of, you know, drive, I don't know how to you know, just to usher in, you know, the cannabis industry in St. Lucia.
Okay, so thanks for that. Again, the RSA as the regulator for the substances is not in a position to dictate what will be in the syllabus for the schools. But we will be having conversations, as I said, with the Ministry of Education. They are one of the stakeholders that we will be speaking to during the course of next week. And of course, we would encourage as much as possible that persons understand what is happening within the cannabis space and for all of the regulated substances. So radiation is another substance that we're supposed to have responsibility for. So we want to ensure people don't continue to see the taboo of hearing the word radiation and understand radiation safety and security. That is something that we also have an interest in. So there will be, from the RSA, certain PSAs to inform persons of things. But when you speak to the syllabus within the schools, it would be for the Ministry of Education to put in place through the current criteria for establishing a syllabus, put in place the new courses or what have you that they would want to incorporate in the syllabus.
Have the government or the RSA decide what they're going to do with the revenues or the profits of the cannabis industry?
So the proceeds of the cannabis industry, you would recognize that farmers do not pay tax. Cooperatives do not pay tax. Medicine is not taxed. So when you speak of the proceeds of the cannabis industry, I hope you recognize that this is an initiative that for the government itself does not make very much money. Outside of license fees, there isn't very much money coming into the government. What it does, however, is it causes a lot of the money to work within the economy generally. So you have cultivators who are farmers who are making money, they can now inject that into the economy in another way. That is the interest that we have in causing the economy to grow. But the government itself, from cannabis, if you actually take a look at it, if medicine is being sold, the government isn't making very much money. So this is an initiative recognizing that we want you to benefit, not necessarily the government to make money.
I thought all those monies that was, like if a regular planter or grower is selling and they put in money into the bank or whatever, doesn't they have to keep a record? Or are you saying those monies selling of cannabis are not taxable?
So I'm saying to you that a number of the players within the industry are already not taxed. So right now, farmers do not pay tax. The RSA legislation is not going to say, oh, well, you don't pay tax, but to me you have to. A farmer does not pay tax currently. Cooperatives, according to the cooperatives legislation, do not pay tax. This legislation is not going to say that a CTE, which is a cooperative, must pay us tax. So when it comes to these entities, if they are part and parcel of the regime, and the majority of them would have been your cultivators, they are not being taxed currently. If your central trading entity at the center of the entire industry is a cooperative, it's not being taxed currently. So we are not in a position to say that the government will be getting considerable revenue from the persons who are cultivating cannabis. And we also recognize that you do not want to artificially inflate the cost of the cannabis because you have an illicit market that you are also trying to cause to become legitimate. So you don't want to heavily tax the cannabis product and end up in a situation where the legal cannabis product is very expensive, the illegal cannabis product is much cheaper, and persons now feel a need to go to the illicit market. So as the legislation has been drafted, though there is the ability for you to tax product itself, the majority of the players within the space do not pay tax.
I'm still a little bit confused because you mentioned about you don't want to heavily tax cannabis. So which means there are cannabis products or cannabis there would be some form of taxable. Because of into all the states and everywhere I've traveled, buying cannabis products in dispensaries or medicinal and recreational, cannabis is being taxed all over the board. There's a taxable. So with how St. Lucia, who say they're going to come in, or the IRS are going to come in, and not taxing the growers or the big foreign investors, I don't see.
I didn't say the big foreign investors.
No, well, we, because I believe we, the small people, at some point, we are going to get taxed. Don't tell us that we are not going to get taxed now, when at the back line, when things are happening, we are going to get taxed. That's just my concern.
So again, what I'm saying to you is the individuals who are within this space who require that sort of assistance, because they would have been your traditional cultivators and your farmers, the legislation, and this is not the RSA legislation, that is legislation that exists already. So it's not peculiar to cannabis. Your banana farmers don't pay tax. They don't pay tax. So I'm saying to you, if a cannabis cultivator comes into this space, similarly, he is not going to be paying tax. Now, when it comes to your cannabis products, if it is that there is the ability for you to tax cannabis products, which the legislation can allow for, you still have challenges where you do not want to artificially inflate the cost of the cannabis. So when you say that the amount of money government will be making from it, I recognize that within some of the US states there's considerable taxation on cannabis. But in our context, where cannabis is so easily and readily available, I would not be so bold as to say that government will be making a lot of money off of cannabis, especially in the initial stages of the industry. Because if you are so to do, you will not then be able to cause persons to want to transition to a legitimate market, and you will not then be able to have a comparable price. But again, if it is that you are a farmer of cannabis, that is not a conversation for only the RSA. That is a broader conversation.
For example, let's say I'm a cultivator and I'm capable, that's fine. And I'm capable of...
No, you use the mic so that they can hear on Zoom.
I was very somebody online that can really watch. I'm not very up. When you say not tax, for example, if I have a corporation that's a farm.
A cooperative.
A cooperative or LLC that's a farm.
No, a cooperative and an LLC are different.
Oh, I see. Right? How does that work in terms of taxes?
So the cooperative would not be paying its tax. A company would pay the usual tax threshold that it pays. So under your inland revenue legislation, the company is required to pay that threshold depending on its revenue. The company pays that.
Right.
But I'm saying to you, a cooperative does not pay tax. So if it is that a cooperative becomes part of the industry, similar, it would not pay tax.
Okay. So if I have a cooperative making tens of millions of dollars.
So I would say to you, look through the cooperative legislation which exists, and you will see the provisions that I'm referencing.
Just ask you.
So question, as a traditional farmer, as we know with the banana farmers, there are times that they require extra hands, extra workers. As a traditional cannabis farmer, if I do need extra hands, I need workers, do they too have to have licenses?
So no, you can get permission to have workers within your farm. If you have a license, they get a security clearance to work within the cannabis space, but they would not have to have a license if they work with a cultivator, no.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so we'll take two more questions, and we will then close. Okay, so we have somebody on Zoom that wants to ask a question.
consultation that is taking place. Yeah, I think that this was a very informative consultation, and I'm very impressed. However, what I realize have been missing from most of the topics in this consultation is the awareness of public education. Because you have youths, you have persons applying to the different ministries for consent, for license and certain things. However, there needs to be education, a strong education system in terms of the whole mechanism of cannabis, industry, downstream cannabis in terms of the stigmatization and knowledge of cannabis, so as to maintain a proper agricultural practice understanding. Because if you are growing cannabis, most traditional farmers tend to use like animal feces. Since cannabis is a hydrogenic plant, we use a lot of things like bat feces, cow feces, and these things. And you wouldn't know of salmonella bacteria and all these different things that people would be using in turn. So if you are speaking about medicinal cannabis, then there needs to be a rapid training for persons who wishes to get into the industry, because it is the new form of agriculture. I was very pleased yesterday when I realized that there is an amnesty in St. Lucia, because that amnesty is going to allow the illicit farmers to now become regulated farmers, where a proper agricultural practice and the codes of conduct that is being set by the Bureau of Standards and by the St. Lucia whole agricultural system can now put in place a proper framework of cannabis policy for St. Lucia, because it is not only about incorporating cultivators to plant, it is also about the medicinal aspect, because a lot of people today, though cannabis works so well for so many different complications, there is still a stigmatization among sick persons who are afraid to take the medicinal cannabis. When a sick person, instead of tasting cannabis or applying the cannabis under the tongue, can simply apply a cannabis oil to their pulse, where they would feel the full effects of the whole cannabis thing. So knowledge is very important. But I am very impressed by yourself and the female chair, in terms of the way you handled this consultation, and I give thanks for being part of it this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I will take two questions from the platform, and then we'll allow for another question from the floor. We have one question here. Will the government provide grants to help cultivators grow their cannabis business, specifically if they want to acquire land? So again, the RSA as a regulator will not be in a space to determine how that happens, but we will be engaging the Crown Lands and the other government entities to ensure they are aware of the cannabis regime and they are prepared for these requests to come from the public. Will a cannabis cultivator be reimbursed like a banana farmer in the event of a natural disaster, hurricane, once they have a license? So again, it would be for the Ministry of Agriculture in dealing with the farmers, and which includes your cannabis farmers who are now legitimate farmers, and determine what price point they would be meeting these persons at if in fact there was a hurricane or other disaster and they would have lost their crop. All right, so we'll take one more question from the floor. All right, so if we...
I'll ask the last question. When will this all transpire? I know they said the first quarter, which is next month or something like that, or April. So is there a date or when we could expect
so we do
us
not
to
have
cross
a
that
date.
line?
So we do not have a date. What we have is a bill at a very advanced stage, and that is what we have come here to present to you this evening. That is what we have put online for other persons to be able to review and give their comments and feedback on. If it is that we have robust suggestions that we have to go back to the drawing board and change the bill entirely, it will take us considerable time to do so. If it is that persons are, for the greater part, okay with the bill as drafted or are requesting minimal tweaks, then the amount of time for the amendments would be negligible, and we would be able to have the document placed before the Cabinet of Ministers for approval and Parliament for enactment in a short space of time. So it comes down to the comments we receive.
All right, someone asked me to ask you a question. Says,
Okay, we'll take that as the last question.
Yeah, the last question. Will there be a PSAs to sensitize the public on this new path with cannabis, in particular, the CDB and THC elements, especially where the medicinal and recreational uses are concerned?
So yes, we will be having some PSAs to inform persons on the RSA's role with regard to cannabis, the legislation and what the opportunities are, and other matters surrounding cannabis as we go along. All right? So thank you for coming out. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for the interest that you've shown in not just the cannabis industry generally, but in this process. Very often persons do not get these opportunities, or when they do not take these opportunities. So we're excited to see so many persons turn out. We realize that we also have quite a few persons on the online platform. So we're happy to see persons with that level of interest. We're hoping to see comments coming into the email address that we provided, indicating what concerns you have, or what advice you have for us, so they can be considered and incorporated into the bill, so that the bill is not coming from us to you, but is as you see fit for St. Lucia. So thank you again for coming out, and we will be in touch going forward as we seek to complete this iterative process of the cannabis legislation and place it before Parliament in the coming weeks and months.